In this video, we'll be taking a look at 5 college basketball games happening on February 16, 2026, and providing you with free team picks and total picks for each one of those games, so 10 picks in total. Welcome back to Cash Out Sports. Let's dive right into it. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe and to click the bell icon to get notified as soon as these videos get released, so that you have more time to plan out your bets as we provide these videos on a daily basis. I can guarantee that you'll have all the important information that you'll need on these 5 college basketball games after fully watching this video. One more thing before we start. If you would like to gain access to our best exclusive sports picks to take your journey to the next level, then check out our Patreon in the link down below, where we offer our best single picks, parlay picks, and much more. Now let's get started. South Alabama versus Marshall. South Alabama heads into Huntington for this matchup feeling like the polished outfit that has quietly piled up wins, while Marshall walks in as the loud neighbor that loves chaos and has no interest in turning the volume down. South Alabama has the cleaner record on paper, something like 19-7 overall with strong league form, and that kind of run gives you a certain calm confidence when you walk into a hostile gym. Marshall, though, is right behind with a solid mark in the mid-teens for wins and only a handful of league losses, and more importantly, they have turned their home court into a real problem, stacking up something like an 11-3 type record in their own building, which says a lot about how comfortable they are in front of their crowd. South Alabama's identity leans into control, that classic road-friendly profile where you guard hard, take smart shots, and try to remove the random swings that hostile arenas feed on. They have built a reputation as one of the stingier defenses in the conference, holding teams to tough looks and dragging possessions into the kind of half-court grind that frustrates opponents who like to run and gun. They shoot well enough themselves to avoid long scoring droughts, and that is huge on the road because nothing gets a student section louder than back-to-back empty trips followed by a transition 3 in your face. Marshall is the opposite personality type, the team that wants more possessions, more threes, and more chances for the game to turn into a track meet rather than a chess match. They lean into tempo, space the floor, and let it fly from deep, piling up threes both in volume and efficiency, which naturally gives them that feeling of being one big run away from blowing a game open at any moment. That sort of style can look reckless when the shots are not falling, but when the building is rocking and they see a couple of early jumpers drop, it suddenly turns into a wave that visiting teams struggle to ride out. On their home floor, with that pace and confidence and with how often they have already taken care of business there, Marshall's profile fits the role of the favorite that not only wants to win, but wants to stretch the margin and put a stamp on it. As our first pick for this matchup, the Marshall Thundering Herd to cover the spread as favorites is our full game side pick. Both teams have shown they can fill it up, just in very different ways, and that contrast tends to create a fun rhythm where each side pushes the other away from its comfort zone. South Alabama games often land in that low to mid-140s sort of window where their defense tries to manage the chaos, but their offense still has enough punch to keep things lively. Marshall games, on the other hand, often live a bit higher, drifting into that mid-150s neighborhood because of the tempo, the quick threes, and the occasional defensive gamble that either turns into a steal or a wide-open shot the other way. The interesting part here is that South Alabama's defensive label can be a little misleading when you look at how some of their recent scores have played out. They have been dragged into some wild finishes, with contests that turned into offensive shootouts despite their best efforts to slow things down, especially when opponents hit early shots and force them to trade baskets instead of trading stops. Marshall has been living in that same world, with several recent games turning into high-scoring affairs, where both teams comfortably clear the kind of totals that make you glance at the box score twice. When you combine Marshall's willingness to fire from deep with South Alabama's ability to answer on the other end, you get a setup where each made three is like an invitation for the other side to respond in kind. Late-game situations add another layer to the scoring puzzle. If this stays within a few possessions, you can see the classic college pattern: quick fouls, extended free throw sequences, and rushed possessions that either produce fast points or fast breaks the other way. Even if the game briefly slows in the middle, those final few minutes can tack on a surprising amount of scoring, especially with both teams capable of getting to the line and knocking down freebies under pressure. So while the styles might clash on paper, the reality is that those exact differences can actually push the combined number higher rather than lower, turning what starts as a tactical battle into something that feels a lot more like a scoring showcase by the final buzzer. As our second pick for this matchup, over the projected total is our full game total pick. New Orleans versus Incarnate Word. When the schedule makers circle New Orleans at Incarnate Word for a Monday night, they basically set up a Southland matchup that feels like a coin toss with a little built-in chaos potential. The market treats it that way too, with Incarnate Word handed that tiny home bump and New Orleans catching the points on the road, so you are really talking about a game where 1 or 2 possessions can change everything for spread bettors. That kind of spot is where people who live on Action Network or ESPN apps start arguing in group chats because a short number in a smaller conference can feel both inviting and terrifying at the same time. Every name you would hear attached to this game checks out on the current 2025 to 2026 rosters for both schools, and the official pages and the usual betting injury hubs list absolutely no key pieces ruled out. So this is not one of those situations where you are worrying about a surprise scratch or some starter in street clothes during warm-ups. It is full strength February conference basketball with both teams bringing what they have been all season. That is when identity matters more than preseason blurbs or early season noise, and by now both of these programs have shown who they really are to anyone paying even casual attention. New Orleans has quietly built a profile that is more solid than flashy, pulling the offense up into roughly the middle tier nationally while still leaving a few cracks on the defensive end that can frustrate anyone who loves clean numbers. They live at the free throw line, they battle well enough on the glass to hang with most front courts in this league, and they have that gritty feel that shows up more in how games play out than in any single highlight. Honestly, it is the kind of team that will not always make the highlight reel, but it will make you nod if you have a ticket in your pocket. What really jumps off the page for them is not how they look in one game, it is how they have treated bettors over time. They sit at 14-12 against the spread overall, with an 8-2 run against the spread over their last 10 games and a 4-1 mark against the spread in their last 5 on the road, which is exactly the type of pattern that makes people say things like, they just cover, and they have turned into that slightly annoying group that might not dominate the standings but keeps beating the closing number, so if you have gone against them lately, you probably remember it with a little sting. Incarnate Word, on the other hand, looks like a fun offense trapped inside a horror montage for anyone laying points. They have those big scoring guards, they let it fly from deep, and on paper that style always sounds exciting. But the results keep undercutting the appeal. They have dropped 10 of their last 12 overall, and against the spread they are sitting on a rough 1-11 slide in that same window, with 0-5 against the spread in their last 5 at home and just 1-9 against the spread in league play. That is not a small wobble, that is a full trend, and it keeps turning modest lines into traps for people who trust the home court more than the recent performance. The recent box scores tell the same story with a little extra sting. Incarnate Word is coming off a 91-83 home loss to Nichols, a game where they scored enough to keep things interesting but gave up buckets all night and never really rewarded anyone who trusted them. New Orleans is coming off a 1-point loss at Houston Christian, a 60-61 grinder where they turned the game into a scrap, stayed inside the number, and walked out feeling like they did everything but steal the win. One team keeps finding ways to reward tickets even in heartbreak, while the other keeps stretching small lines into landmines for anyone who tried to trust them. This is a projection based on how late-season conference games like this usually behave, how these two teams have been trending, and how they seem to respond when the margin for error is tiny. Given a short spread with a live underdog that has been consistently cashing while the favorite has been burning through backers, it feels a lot easier to lean toward the side that embraces ugly, whistle-heavy games on the road than the one that keeps slipping in its own building. As our first pick for this matchup, the New Orleans Privateers to cover the spread as underdogs is our full game side pick. The total number the book has hung is ambitious, and it leans into the idea that both offenses can turn this into a shootout if they get even a little bit comfortable. On the surface, that makes sense because both teams can score. New Orleans tends to land in the mid-70s on offense and allow opponents to creep into the low 80s, while Incarnate Word usually sits somewhere in the mid-70s for both scoring and points allowed. If you mash that together, their typical combined output lands in the low 150s, which suggests a more modest scoring environment than the aggressive total that has been posted. That gap is the tax you pay for perception. New Orleans has leaned slightly toward higher scoring results on the whole, and the history of these meetings in this building carries a bit of track meet reputation, so the total gets nudged upward. Odds makers know people love overs in smaller conference games where defenses are not exactly famous, so the number drifts a few points richer than what the average game flow would really justify. It is like pricing a popular sneaker a little higher because everyone talks about it, even if the materials are the same as last year. Recent form throws even more noise into that picture. Incarnate word has bounced from wild scores like 93 to 106 or 91 to 83 into much quieter results, such as 74 to 62, 58 to 80, and even 46 to 56. Same basic style, same 3 happy offense, but completely different totals depending on whether those jumpers actually fall. New Orleans just walked out of that 60 to 61 slog at Houston Christian after playing in some higher scoring wins not long before, so they have already shown they can get dragged into slow, half-court possessions when the matchup demands it. That kind of volatility is great for storyline drama, but it is tricky for an elevated total. Short rest and fresh game film add another wrinkle. Both staffs have plenty to chew on from the past week, and with conference seeding pressure simmering, empty trips suddenly feel heavier in the second half. That usually nudges coaches towards slightly more deliberate possessions, more half-court sets, and more possessions where both sides are willing to live with a contested jumper late in the clock rather than taking the first decent look. You still have 2 offenses that can score and a history that suggests points, so anyone backing a lower total here will probably sweat a few spurts. Even so, the combination of their usual combined scoring, the fatigue factor, and the swingy shooting profile, especially on the Incarnate word side, all lean toward this game finishing a bit shy of the number that has been posted. As our second pick for this matchup, under the projected total is our full game total pick. Drexel versus Stony Brook. Coastal Athletic Association hoops under the lights with Drexel heading to Long Island to face Stony Brook feels like one of those games that sneaks up on people. It is not a classic big brand matchup, but it is the kind of grindy conference game that shapes seeding and quietly decides who is feeling confident in March. Stony Brook has been comfortable in its own gym, feeding off that small arena energy, while Drexel comes in with that familiar road warrior edge that this program has built under a staff that leans into toughness rather than flash. You look at these two and you do not see a huge gap in talent. You see 2 groups that know each other, know the scouting reports, and know that every trip up the floor is going to feel like work rather than a track meet. The fun twist here is the contrast in how they like to play. Drexel is perfectly happy to squeeze the pace, make you stare at the shot clock, and turn what should be a smooth offensive possession into a wrestling match for position. They sit near the bottom of the country in tempo, and it is not by accident. That slow, deliberate style takes some of the comfort away from home favorites that want to get out and run in front of their crowd, and it shrinks the number of possessions so that every missed box out or lazy turnover suddenly feels huge. Stony Brook would rather get into its rhythm earlier in the clock, push the ball, and let its guards play with some freedom, but Drexel drags opponents into half-court decision-making where screening angles, cuts, and patience matter a lot more than flair. We already saw a clear version of that script in the first meeting. Back in early January, Drexel held Stony Brook to just 37 points, with the Seawolves going 12 of 59 from the field and 5 of 27 from 3, a brutal shooting line that was not only about misses, but about how few clean looks they actually got. That game never really tilted into chaos, it just tightened and tightened until Stony Brook was stuck taking contested jumpers and Drexel calmly stacked stops and controlled the scoreboard. You cannot assume a carbon copy in a rematch, especially with the Seawolves back at home, but styles tend to show up again. And Drexel's preference for physical, possession-by-possession basketball is exactly the sort of thing that keeps an underdog hanging around inside the number. In a game where the matchup leans towards slower, tougher sequences, where the visiting defense has already shown it can smother this opponent's comfort zones, and where the gap between these rosters is more about approach than raw talent, the points with the road team carry real weight for the spread. As our first pick for this matchup, the Drexel Dragons to cover the spread as underdogs is our full game side pick. Drexel games hover only a little above the low to mid 130s in combined scoring, while Stony Brook contests usually land closer to the low 140s, so if you just stared at season averages on ESPN or a KenPom page, you might expect a bigger number and a little more wiggle room for points. Instead, you get a projection that already bakes in respect for Drexel's pace and defensive mentality, and that is where things get interesting. Drexel drags tempo down as a matter of identity, not as a one-off tactic. They work deep into possessions, they guard the three-point line with real intent, and they force you to keep running offense instead of settling for the first semi-open jumper. That alone trims a few possessions off a typical college game, and when you combine that with Stony Brook's willingness to fire from deep, you get a scoring profile that is a little boom or bust. Stony Brook has already ripped off more than 700 three-point attempts, hitting 249 of 704 from beyond the arc, which is a big chunk of their offensive personality. When those shots fall, like in that wild double overtime win over Charleston where they poured in 112 points and tied a CAA record for combined scoring, the scoreboard can explode and make any under look silly. When those same jumpers are even a bit off against a defense that is dialed in, the whole thing can bog down fast. The first clash between these teams is the reminder sitting in the background. That one ended 56-37 for a total of just 93 points, with Stony Brook never really able to unlock its perimeter game and Drexel perfectly content to play chess instead of sprinting up and down the floor. You do not expect that kind of offensive drought again, especially with the Seawolves shooting in friendlier surroundings, but the underlying ingredients are still there. Drexel prefers low possession, grind-heavy basketball. Stony Brook leans on high-variance shooting from deep, and both defenses are respectable enough that nothing comes easy at the rim. Even if the rematch brings some shooting regression and a few more made threes, the path to a true shootout still needs a lot of things to go right, and it needs them to go right on both sides at the same time. With the pace likely muted again and each empty trip feeling a little heavier than usual, the more natural script points toward another game that lands below what those raw season scoring numbers might suggest. As our second pick for this matchup, under the projected total is our full game total pick. Southern versus Texas Southern. Southern and Texas Southern meeting in Houston has that familiar Southwestern Athletic Conference energy, a little chaotic and a little personal all at once. You have one team with a cleaner record, Southern sitting around 12-13 overall and 8-4 in league play, and the other, Texas Southern, carrying a rougher-looking 8-15 and 6-6 mark that does not quite tell the whole story. On paper, Southern looks like the more stable group, the kind of team casual fans expect to take care of business. But the setting matters, the gym matters, and in this conference the home floor often feels like an extra player rather than just a painted logo. Southern plays with a style that invites both praise and trouble. They push, they run, they trust their offense, and they live with the fact that their defense will give opponents plenty of chances to stay in it. Their efficiency numbers paint them as slightly above average overall, a team that can score in bursts but also one that does not slam the door as often as a favorite usually should. Texas Southern, on the other hand, has a season profile that looks worse than the reality of who they are right now, because that rough non-conference stretch early in the year dragged their numbers through the mud against bigger programs and tougher travel spots. Honestly, anyone who has watched this conference for a few seasons knows those early road games can make a solid team look broken for weeks. Recent form shows Southern riding a nice rhythm, picking up wins and looking like a group that believes it belongs near the top of the standings. Texas Southern might not have the same headline record, but inside the conference they have quietly stacked some convincing home performances, including blowouts where they turn visiting teams into props for the band and student section. Here is the thing, when a team that looks mediocre on the full season split suddenly starts thumping league rivals by big margins at home, it usually means the numbers have not fully caught up to who they have become. Add the emotional layer that this is a rematch, with Southern already taking the first meeting by double digits earlier in the season, and you get a Texas Southern squad that has every reason to circle this one in bright red. Revenge is not a stat on Ken Palm, but it lives in the legs and the effort on loose balls, especially in conference play where everybody remembers every result a bit too well. Southern still has edges. They have the more reliable offense, they have momentum, and they carry themselves like a contender rather than a scrapper. But that same open style that helps them pull away sometimes also gives opponents room to answer, and on the road, against a familiar foe, those little windows can add up. Texas Southern has already shown at home that they can defend with more pride than their raw averages suggest, and that they can use their crowd and their comfort in the building to turn games into long, drawn-out fights instead of track meets controlled by the visitor. In a matchup where the gap in talent and form is real but not enormous, and where the team with the worst record is actually playing its most confident basketball on its own court, taking the points with the home dog makes more sense than trusting the road favorite to completely impose its will for 40 straight minutes. As our first pick for this matchup, the Texas Southern Tigers to cover the spread as underdogs is our full game side pick. Southern has been living in that 80s neighborhood on the scoreboard and giving almost as much back. And Texas Southern has mixed in both shootouts and lower-scoring grinders, which is exactly the kind of inconsistency that makes totals tricky but also interesting. The first time these two met, the final landed comfortably in a high-scoring range, with both sides finding enough rhythm to push the combined number well past the kind of middle ground many people expect from this conference. That memory tends to stick, especially for fans and bettors who remember a fun game more vividly than a slow one. Look a little closer, though, and the picture is not quite as simple as these two always light it up. Southern's offense is genuinely solid, with an efficiency profile that fits a team that likes to move and attack early in possessions. But their success often comes from tempo and free throw volume rather than lights-out jump shooting. Texas Southern's attack is more modest, a bit stop and start, less explosive, and more willing to use the clock. When Texas Southern has been at its best lately, especially in home wins, the pattern has not been full-on chaos but rather solid defense and stretches where they hold opponents in the low 60s or mid-60s, with the game feeling controlled instead of frantic. The shooting picture backs that idea up. Neither team has a three-point profile that screams automatic, with percentages that sit in a respectable but not terrifying range and attempts that do not resemble the all-out chucking you see from some modern offenses. That kind of shooting baseline does not mean they cannot hit a hot streak. It just means that getting to a very high combined score consistently requires help from extra possessions, turnovers, or a whistle that sends everyone to the line over and over. Let me explain. When you are leaning on pace and free throws more than pure shooting, any slight slowdown, any referee crew that lets more contact go, or any coach who decides to squeeze the game for a few key stretches can drag the total outcome down. Texas Southern, as the team that benefits from control and rhythm, has every reason to try to keep this from turning into a pure race. If they lean into longer possessions, focus on the glass, and force Southern to work through half-court sets rather than easy transition looks, the clock becomes their friend and the score naturally shrinks a little. Even a few empty trips from each side, a couple of broken possessions, or a stretch where both squads cool off from three can make a big difference when the expected number is already on the ambitious side. So while the reputation of this matchup hints at another high-scoring show, the mix of streaky shooting, the possibility of a more controlled tempo, and the way Texas Southern tends to win with defense at home all gently push the expectation toward a more modest total than that reputation might suggest. As our second pick for this matchup, over/under the projected total is our full game total pick. Houston versus Iowa State. Big time, Big 12 basketball shows up here with Houston rolling into Ames to face Iowa State in a top-tier showdown that feels bigger than a regular February game. Both programs bring sparkling records, national respect, and that sense that every possession might matter in March, not just tonight. The matchup sets up with Iowa State in its own building, treated as the small home favorite, which already tells you the market respects both sides and expects this thing to live in a very tight window. Houston shows up as that classic tough outfit that travels well, scoring about 78.3 points per night while giving up only 61.3, with opponents stuck at 39.3% from the field and just over 31% from three. That profile screams toughness. It is the kind of team you picture grinding through late possessions, getting a body on every rebound, and turning half mistakes into live ball runouts. Emmanuel Sharp at 16.6 points per game, Kingston Flemings at 16.4, Milos Usin at 11.2, Chris Sanek Jr. at 9.6, and Joseph Tugler at 7.8 give Houston a core that can score without sacrificing that defensive identity, which is not always easy to pull off. Road games have not scared this group much either, with Houston stacking wins away from home and looking comfortable in opposing gyms where a lot of teams shrink a bit. Iowa State, though, brings a different kind of energy to the table, more like a constant pressure cooker. The Cyclones are putting up 84.2 points per game on a wild 50.6% from the field and close to 39.8% from three, which means almost every trip down the floor can turn into a clean look if you blink. Milan Momcilovic at 18.4 points per game, Joshua Jefferson at 16.7, and Tamin Lipsey at 13.2 headline an offense that flows, cuts, and shoots in rhythm, and they do it without forgetting about defense, holding opponents to just 64.5 points a night. Hilton Coliseum helps that mindset, and honestly, you can almost hear it in your head when you think about a big Monday game there. Iowa State has been perfect at home this season at 14-0 and an absurd 47-2 at home since the start of the 2023-2024 stretch, which turns that building into a genuine weapon. The personnel chart backs up how loaded this matchup really is. For Houston, Cordell Jefferson is sidelined with a knee issue and Bryce Jackson is in a redshirt spot for the season, but the main rotation pieces are active. For Iowa State, Mason Williams is out with a hip injury, and Texavion Mitchell is listed as questionable with an undisclosed problem. Yet the headline names that drive this attack are expected on the floor. So you basically get both teams with their primary engines ready, one that loves to squeeze the game and one that loves to speed it up, battling inside a building where the home team simply does not lose often. The tension comes from that contrast. Houston's defense and composure on the road against Iowa State's relentless shooting and the emotional wave of that home crowd. Hilton turns steals into roars, roars into runs, and runs into genuine scoreboard pressure, especially when the Cyclones are already this efficient from the field. Houston can absolutely answer with its own toughness and shot making, no doubt. But with the spread sitting in that narrow, almost coin flip neighborhood, the combination of Iowa State's home record, its offensive efficiency, and its ball pressure that feeds off the crowd tends to pull this matchup slightly in one direction when you think about who is more likely to land on the right side of the number. As our first pick for this matchup, the Iowa State Cyclones to cover the spread as favorites is our full game side pick. Both Houston and Iowa State have more unders than overs logged this season, and in league play it has been even more tilted that way, with Houston cashing the over only 3 times against 9 unders and Iowa State only twice against 10 unders. On the surface, that screams slow tempo and low totals all night. Here is the thing, though, the way these teams have been scoring lately tells a slightly different story if you actually look at the final scores instead of just the over and under column. Houston's last handful of games reads like a team that can absolutely get to the high 70s without losing its identity. They put up 79-55 against UCF, 77-66 on the road at BYU, 66-52 at Utah, 78-64 against Kansas State, and 76-54 versus Cincinnati. The pattern is pretty simple. Houston locks teams down, but still sees its own offense live in that mid to upper 70s range more often than not. That is not the profile of a group that is afraid to score. It is more like a team that is comfortable playing efficient, patient offense and then letting its defense do the suffocating. Iowa State's recent stretch has been even louder from a scoring standpoint. They dropped 97-67 on Colorado, 95-61 at Kansas State, then played a tighter 72-69 battle with Baylor, followed by a low-scoring 55-62 grind at TCU, and then handled Kansas 74-56. That is a lot of nights where the Cyclones flirt with or smash through big numbers while still showing they can survive a slow, ugly game when things bog down. It shows an offense that has multiple gears, not just one. They can run, they can space you, and if you try to slow them, they have shot makers who can still beat the shot clock. Season-long numbers back up that sense that both sides have more scoring punch than a pure slog game. Houston is at 78.3 points per game on 45.3% shooting, with 34.1% from 3 and an impressive 77.2% at the free throw line. Iowa State answers with 84.2 points a night on that 50.6% shooting clip and nearly 40% from deep, which is the kind of efficiency that can push a game higher even against a very good defense. Put simply, when both of these offenses find any kind of rhythm, they do not need a crazy pace to stack points. The script that feels most realistic is a slower, tense opening stretch where both defenses flex early, followed by a second half that loosens up as foul trouble and fatigue start to creep in. Coaches tend to lean on their main guys in this kind of matchup, and that often means better shot quality late, not worse. You can picture the whistle picking up with 5 or 6 minutes left, trips to the stripe stacking quickly, and that matters even more when Houston is this reliable at the line. Throw in the very real chance of a tight finish with intentional fouls, extra possessions, and maybe even a last-minute 3 to extend the game, and the late stages start to look friendlier to points than the raw under trend suggests. Even with the history saying these teams have leaned to the under, including a long run of Iowa State conference games staying lower and several recent meetings between these programs landing below the number, this particular matchup does not feel like a pure grind from buzzer to buzzer. It feels more like a game where the defensive reputation on both sides has pulled the projection a bit too low compared to the actual offensive talent, efficiency, and the way late-game situations tend to inflate scoring in tight, high-stakes spots. As our second pick for this matchup, over the projected total is our full game total pick. That's all for now, so if you have any other games you would like reviewed, then leave a comment down below with the game you would like analyzed, subscribe to our channel, leave a like on this video, and we'll get to it as soon as we possibly can. We would also love to hear your opinion on the picks presented to you in this video, whether you agree or disagree with them, so leave a comment down below and do let us know.